By 8:30 on the evening my father died, my stepmother had already changed the locks on the front door. She stood in the hallway when I came downstairs with my overnight bag and told me to pack my things and get out because it was her house now. I zipped my bag and walked past her without a word, knowing I had a set of keys in my pocket to a building she didn't even know existed. Welcome back to Payback Stories. I'm Jessica, and if you enjoy stories about family drama, betrayal, and karma finally catching up, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment. Let's get into it. The Wednesday before my father died, I drove 40 minutes to his house for dinner. I did this every week. My stepmother, Susan, made pot roast on Wednesdays. She always set 3 places at the table. Mine was never one of them. I had stopped saying anything about it 6 years ago. I just went in through the side door, found my own plate in the cabinet, set it at the corner of the table, and ate whatever she cooked. It was a routine. My father, Robert, was sitting in his usual chair when I walked in. He looked terrible. He had been losing weight for months. Susan kept telling everyone it was just a loss of appetite, but I had looked at his medical records through the hospital portal. I knew his heart was failing. Susan's daughter, Ashley, was scrolling through her phone across from him. She was 24 and still living at home. Susan always told people Ashley was just being smart with her money by staying home. I didn't care either way because it wasn't my business. Halfway through the meal, my father set his fork down. He asked me if I got the building files sorted out. Before I could answer, Susan cut him off. She told him not to talk about work at dinner because they were supposed to be discussing their kitchen remodel. My father looked at me, I looked at him, and he just picked up his fork again. After dinner, I washed the dishes. I always wash the dishes. On the counter beside the sink, there was a stack of mail. I saw the electric bill, an insurance statement, and a letter from a law firm addressed to my father. Before I could read the return address, Susan walked over and swept the entire stack into a drawer. She said it was just junk. I dried my hands, grabbed my coat, and drove home. That was the last Wednesday I ate in that house. My mother died when I was 10. After she passed, my father didn't really know how to handle a 10-year-old girl. He wasn't the type of guy to sit down and talk about feelings. He worked in commercial real estate and finance. So, he did the only thing he knew how to do to bond with me. He taught me math. Every Saturday morning, he drove me around in his truck and we looked at properties. He would pull up in front of a commercial building or a house with a for sale sign and ask me what I thought it was worth. I would guess and he would correct me. Then he would explain exactly why. He taught me how to calculate square footage, lot size, comparable sales, and interest rates. By the time I was 12, I could read a mortgage statement and estimate property taxes. He told me once that money doesn't fix everything, but it fixes a lot of things that people pretend have nothing to do with money. That same year, he married Susan. She moved in with her 2-year-old daughter, Ashley. Within 6 months, my bedroom was repainted and turned into a playroom for Ashley. I was moved to the smallest room in the house, right next to the garage. My father asked me to be patient. He said Susan had a hard time in her previous marriage and was just trying to get settled. I was 12, so I agreed. Susan wasn't abusive in a criminal sense. She was just incredibly thorough about erasing me from the household. By my 2nd year living with her, she had reorganized every room to center around her and Ashley. The family photos of my mother were moved to the hallway, then upstairs, and finally packed away in the attic. Susan replaced them with studio portraits of herself, my father, and Ashley. I wasn't in any of them. I was never invited to the photo shoots. Susan also took total control of the household money. She kept a massive spreadsheet on the family desktop. Every grocery run, gas receipt, and subscription was tracked. She held a budget review with my father on the 1st of every month. It was the only family meeting I was specifically told not to attend. My father told me Susan's ex-husband had left her with massive debt and ruined her credit, so her need to control the finances was rooted in anxiety. I understood that, but she weaponized that control against me. By the time I was 14, Susan was sending out Christmas cards that said the Robert family with a photo of the 3 of them. When a neighbor asked Susan why I wasn't in the picture, Susan laughed and said I was just too busy with school to take photos. I was standing right next to her when she said it. I hadn't been busy. I had been home all week. My father heard the conversation. He looked at me, opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then just walked out to the garage. That was the exact moment I realized I had to start taking care of myself. The summer I turned 16, my father drove me to his office. He sat me down and handed me a folder with my name on it. He told me he had started an index fund for me 2 years ago with $5,000. The balance was sitting at just over $6,000. I didn't fully grasp compound interest yet, but I understood what he was doing. He was building a financial wall that Susan couldn't access. He asked me not to mention it to Susan. He said she would just worry because she couldn't track it on her spreadsheet. He handed me a cheap pocket calculator and told me to keep it and to always do my own math. I still have it. Over the next 2 years, my father deposited small amounts into that fund. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. But more importantly, he started teaching me about a commercial property downtown. It was a 6-story building, mostly office space. He owned a partial stake in it. He bought in when the neighborhood was rough, so the price was low. He told me that someday, the building would be mine. 6 years later, I graduated college with a degree in forensic accounting. My father's initial investment in the index fund had grown, but the real asset was the commercial building. On my 18th birthday, he had quietly transferred his initial shares of the building into an LLC in my name. I didn't tell anyone. I left for college and never moved back into that house. There was no big argument. I just packed 2 suitcases, loaded them into my used car, and drove to a university 4 hours away. I rented a cheap studio apartment and finally felt like I could relax. My father and I talked every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, right before Susan woke up. We spent 20 minutes talking about the fund, the building shares, and the market. He didn't ask about my personal life, and I didn't ask about Susan. It was how we communicated. Every time I visited home, something else had been erased. My old bedroom was turned into a yoga studio. The garage was converted into a craft room for Ashley. There was not a single picture of me anywhere on the first floor. Susan never asked what I did for a living or how much I made. Because I drove a practical car and dressed simply, she assumed I was just barely getting by. Meanwhile, my father kept executing legal transfers of his commercial real estate assets into my name. By the time I was 28, I owned the 6-story building entirely. The neighborhood had gentrified heavily. The tenants were paying top market rates. That single building was worth more than every house on his street combined. I signed my first major lease renewal the same month Susan remodeled my old bedroom for the 3rd time. When I was 32, my father was diagnosed with severe cardiomyopathy. The doctors said it required medication, rest, and constant monitoring. Susan immediately used his illness to cut off my access to him. The first time I called to arrange a visit, Susan answered and said he was resting and couldn't handle stress. The second time, she told me he didn't want visitors and that she was handling everything. The third time, I just drove to the house. Susan blocked the doorway. She told me that showing up unannounced was bad for his heart and shut the door in my face. I called my Aunt Patricia that night. Patricia was my father's younger sister. She was the only person in the family who saw right through Susan. Patricia told me Susan was telling everyone at their church that I was too busy with work to visit my dying father. I told Patricia I had called 14 times. Patricia said she knew, but she also warned me that Susan had just gotten my father to sign a financial power of attorney. I wasn't worried about my own money. My assets were completely separate, but I knew Susan was building a wall around him. 3 weeks later, my father had a massive stroke. Susan called Patricia, her own friends, the neighbors, and her church group. She organized meal deliveries and hospital visits. She did not call me. I only found out because a nurse at the hospital checked his emergency contact file. My father had listed my cell phone number years ago, and Susan had never thought to update that specific form. My father died on a Wednesday afternoon. The hospital called me at 4:21 p.m. The nurse told me he had suffered a final cardiac event and didn't make it. I thanked her, packed a bag, and drove 3 hours in complete silence. When I got to the house, there were several cars in the driveway. Neighbors and cousins were inside. I walked in through the side door. Susan was in the kitchen arranging flowers. I walked upstairs to the yoga studio, put my bag down on the mat, and sat on the floor. Susan walked into the room a few minutes later. She stood in the doorway and told me I wasn't sleeping there. She said it was her house now and told me to pack my things and go. I said okay. I picked up my bag and walked downstairs. Ashley was standing on the steps, holding her phone. She didn't say a word as I walked past her and out the front door. I drove to a cheap motel a few miles away and checked in. The key to the downtown building was in my pocket. I could have told Susan right then that I owned real estate worth 50 times her house, but I decided to wait. The funeral was held at a small local church. I got there early. Susan and Ashley were sitting in the center of the front row. They had sectioned off the family row with exactly 3 chairs. I sat 3 rows back by myself. Aunt Patricia arrived a few minutes later. She walked right past Susan, sat down next to me, and held my hand. She told me my father had prepared everything and that I just needed to trust the process. After the service, a neighbor came up to me and asked why I wasn't sitting with the family. I told him there were only 3 chairs. He looked at Susan, then back at me, and just walked away. Before everyone left the parking lot, Susan stood on the church steps and announced to the crowd that my father wanted the house to remain the family home, so she and Ashley would be staying there permanently. She didn't look at me once. What she didn't announce was the meeting with the estate attorney scheduled for the following Thursday. The morning after the funeral, Susan hired an appraiser to value the house. He told her it was worth roughly $380,000. Susan wrote that down. Then she went to the bank with the death certificate to check the accounts. The teller pulled up their joint savings account, which had $140,000 in it. Susan was furious. My father had earned a very high income for decades. She asked the teller to search for individual accounts, investment portfolios, or anything else under his name. The teller told her there was absolutely nothing else at that bank. Susan went home and told Ashley about the numbers. Ashley asked about the commercial building downtown that my father used to mention at dinner. Susan realized she had no idea what Ashley was talking about. She called the estate attorney and tried to move the meeting up, but they told her Thursday was the earliest available time. I spent 5 days in that motel. I barely slept. I missed my father. Grief just sits with you, regardless of what is waiting in your bank account. On the 3rd day, I called my attorney, James. I had retained him 2 years earlier when Susan started getting aggressive with my father's accounts. I asked James to confirm my current asset list. He read it off to me. I owned the 6-story commercial building downtown, fully transferred over a decade. I had the index fund, which was now worth a significant amount. I also held equity in 8 other commercial properties across 3 states, purchased through an LLC my father and I managed together. The total value of the assets under my name was approximately $28 million. James confirmed that none of it was part of my father's estate. None of it was subject to probate, and Susan had no legal claim to a single cent of it. I told James I fully expected Susan to challenge it. He told me she would lose. Later that evening, Susan called me. It was the first time she had called me since she kicked me out of the house. Her voice was incredibly sweet, the fake tone she used when guests were over. She asked me if my father ever mentioned a commercial property downtown because she couldn't find the paperwork. I told her everything would be clarified at the reading on Thursday. She dropped the fake tone immediately and demanded to know right then because she was his wife. I told her Thursday was the right time and hung up. She called back 3 times in 7 minutes. I put my phone on silent and ignored her. She was panicking because she had finally realized there was a massive gap in her financial spreadsheet, and I was the only variable she didn't control. The next morning, Aunt Patricia called me. She told me Susan had just withdrawn $80,000 from the joint savings account. Susan used the financial power of attorney my father signed before he died. I called James. He pulled the bank records and confirmed the transaction had posted. A power of attorney legally expires the absolute second the principal dies. Susan had walked into the bank with a death certificate and an expired legal document and basically stole $80,000 from a frozen estate account. James told me the bank messed up by honoring it, but it proved Susan was grabbing cash because she knew she was losing control. The funeral only cost $8,000. That left $72,000 completely unaccounted for. I told James to print the transaction records and bring them to the meeting. The will reading took place at the office of Thomas, my father's estate attorney. It was a standard law office above a bakery. Susan and Ashley arrived first and sat at the head of the conference table. Aunt Patricia arrived next and sat near the middle. 2 of my father's cousins, Richard and William, sat by the window. I walked in last with James. Susan looked at James and asked who he was. I told her he was my attorney. She gave a tight smile and said the will was very simple, so there was no need for drama. Thomas opened his folder. He stated that he needed to explain the structure of the estate before reading the document. He read the probate will first. It stated that Susan received the family house free and clear of any mortgage, as well as the remaining balance of their joint savings account. Ashley received $20,000 from an education fund. Susan nodded and placed her hands flat on the table, looking incredibly satisfied. Then Thomas took off his glasses. He told the room that the probate estate represented only a fraction of my father's actual wealth. He explained that over the course of 18 years, my father had executed a series of legal asset transfers. These were done during his lifetime with full legal documentation and tax filings, meaning they were outside of probate. Susan's face went blank. She asked who the assets were transferred to. Thomas looked directly at me and said they were transferred to his daughter. Susan stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly across the floor. She demanded to know what he was talking about, reminding the room she had been his wife for 22 years. Thomas deferred to James. James opened his briefcase. He pulled out 3 organized folders and set them on the table. He stated that the first folder contained the deed of ownership for the 6-story commercial building downtown, which was fully transferred to me through documented gift transfers between 2008 and 2020. He opened the second folder and stated it contained the summary for an investment portfolio and equity in 8 additional commercial properties, all held under my name. He put his hand on the third folder and told the room that the consolidated valuation of the assets under my name was approximately $28 million. Ashley gasped and put her hands over her mouth. Richard and William just stared. Aunt Patricia nodded once. Susan gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles were completely white. She pointed at me and said I stole his money. James calmly replied that every single transaction was executed voluntarily by my father with independent legal counsel over nearly 2 decades. He told her the assets were my personal property and had nothing to do with the estate. Susan turned to me. She was pale and shaking. She said I sat in her house every Wednesday eating her food while knowing about all of this. I looked at her and said she kicked me out 4 hours after my father died and changed the locks before his body was even cold, so she had no right to lecture me about what I knew. James reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and set it in the middle of the table. He announced that there was one final matter. He stated that 9 days after my father's death, an $80,000 withdrawal was made from the joint savings account using a financial power of attorney. Thomas looked down at his notes. James stated clearly that under state law, a power of attorney terminates at death. The withdrawal was illegal. He noted the funeral expenses were just over $8,000, leaving nearly $72,000 unaccounted for. Aunt Patricia looked at Susan with pure disgust. Thomas advised Susan to hire independent counsel immediately before saying another word about the transaction. Ashley looked at Susan and begged her to explain that it was a mistake. Susan didn't answer her. She just collapsed back into her chair and stared at the table. She started talking about how she cooked and cleaned for him for 22 years and how her first husband left her with nothing and how my father promised she would never be broke again. Thomas told her my father left her a paid-off house and a funded savings account, so she wasn't broke. Susan yelled that he left her a house, but gave me $28 million. Aunt Patricia finally spoke up. She told Susan that my father loved her, but he also knew exactly who she was. Patricia said my father knew Susan would never willingly share a single cent with me, so he made sure I was taken care of long before she could get her hands on the paperwork. Susan whispered that she didn't know any of this. It was true. She didn't know because she never bothered to look past her own spreadsheet. She assumed that because I was quiet, I was powerless. I stood up and picked up my bag. I told the room that everything under my name had been mine for years, and I only came to the meeting so they would all hear the absolute truth. I looked at Susan and told her I would never call or visit her again, and that all future communication had to go through James. I thanked Aunt Patricia, turned toward the door, and stopped. I looked back at Susan and told her to keep the house, because I never needed it. I walked out and shut the door. James followed me to the stairwell. Richard and William caught up with us on the landing. Richard shook my hand and told me my father would be proud. I agreed. I got into my car and sat there for a few minutes. I didn't feel a massive sense of victory. I just cried because my father was gone, and because he had known this exact day was coming for almost 20 years. He couldn't change who Susan was, but he spent 18 years doing paperwork to make sure she could never ruin my life. 3 weeks later, Susan hired an estate contest lawyer. He reviewed all the deeds, tax filings, and corporate documents James sent over. He told Susan she had absolutely no case. The transfers were legal, clean, and done with my father's separate assets over a massive span of time. My father was fully competent, and the law did not require him to tell his wife about gifts made from his own separate property. James sent Susan a formal demand letter for the missing $72,000. Her lawyer advised her to return it immediately to avoid criminal charges for wire fraud and theft from an estate. She wired the money back 10 days later. Ashley texted me shortly after. She apologized for not saying anything when Susan kicked me out of the house. I read the text, but I didn't reply. I had nothing to say to someone who watched me get thrown out onto the street and only felt bad about it after finding out I was rich. The rest of the family completely cut Susan off. The narrative she had spent years building about me being a terrible, absent daughter fell apart the second the financial documents were made public. She isolated me for 2 decades, and in the end, she isolated herself. 6 months later, I moved into a nice apartment downtown. I opened my own forensic accounting firm. I named it after my father. Everything I knew about numbers and patience came directly from him. Aunt Patricia came over for dinner once a month. We talked about my dad and laughed about his obsession with interest rates. I only kept one thing from my childhood home. It sits on my desk right next to my laptop. It is the cheap, plastic pocket calculator my father gave me when I was 16. The buttons stick and the screen flickers, but it still works perfectly. I turn it on sometimes and type in the number. 28 million. The screen just shows the digits. It doesn't judge and it doesn't apologize. It is just math. My father taught me that knowing how to count your own money means you will never be caught off guard. He was right. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Payback Stories for a new family drama story every day, and I'll see you in the next one.